My presentation. Sorry, the thing threw me off here. Next month, the title of my presentation is going to be Ranch Living in the City, and we're going to look at the Rosedale Farm neighborhood in the lower valley of El Paso. So just be prepared. It's about 100 slides, and it's mostly just looking at homes. And so, and these homes were built between 1930 and 1950. So, okay. Well, I always feel weird. I can't ever see anybody up here. Tonight's speaker is Jim Eckles. His talk is titled Space-Related Activities at White Sands Missile Range. I think we all know Jim, but I would just say that he worked at White Sands for over 30 years, and he's also the #1 super fan of Doc Nas, in which he has an upcoming article coming out in the Southern New Mexico Historical Review. So I'll turn it over to Jim. Thanks.
Thank you, Jerry. And Dennis, it's being recorded. I see it on the thing. Event 2 on the lighting. We'll turn down these lights so it's easier for you to see the slides. So I'm going to talk to you about space stuff at White Sands, but I'm going to do first a little history of rocketry because I've got you captured here, and I thought it'd be kind of important to talk about rockets a little bit and why they're important. And then I'm going to talk about unmanned activities at White Sands versus manned activities. And I've got that represented on this first slide. You've got a V2 rocket, which was used for unmanned activities. And of course, you've got the Space Shuttle landing out there back in 1982. So rockets have been around quite a long time. The Chinese put rockets, gunpowder rockets, on arrows to extend their range in battle. And these things would go hundreds and hundreds of yards and create quite a panic, supposedly, within the ranks of the opposition and stuff. And then underneath that, you see 3 individual Congreve rockets. These are British rockets that, on the Star-Spangled Banner, there's the rocket's red glare. Well, that's the War of 1812, and that's Congreve rockets being launched by the British against the United States. But in all these rockets here, basically it's pop bottle technology. Those of you who had pop bottle rockets when you were kids, I used to throw them up in the air, and my cousin and I would have gunfights with pop bottle rockets. The stick behind it is what keeps it stable as it flies. It's not very advanced technology, and it certainly has no real accuracy. But that's what they were working with for centuries until we get into the end of the 19th century. So we got to talk about the main guy about rockets, and that's Isaac Newton. And he proposed these laws of motion. The third law is that for every action, there's a reaction, an equal reaction. And he proposed this way back in 1687. So the example I'm going to give you about Robert Goddard and stuff is that it takes centuries sometimes for these things to sink in, if there's any kind of science. But by the end of the 19th century, scientists, the technology is improving, machinery is improving, and some scientists see the possibility of building a better rocket than a pop bottle rocket. And this Russian here shown on the screen proposes using a rocket for space travel. And he wrote a paper about it in 1898. And he explains the physics behind it, why it'll work. In 1919, Robert Goddard, who you're all familiar with, he was shooting rockets in the 1930s over at Roswell. He's from Massachusetts. In 1919, he wrote this paper about a method for reaching extreme altitudes using rockets. And in fact, he proposed using a rocket to send an explosive charge to the moon, which could be detected with telescopes from the Earth. That got him blistered. The New York Times ran an article and said the good Dr. Goddard needs to keep working in fields he knows something about. Obviously, he knows nothing about space travel because we all know that there's no air in space and nothing for the rocket to push against. So These guys have all missed Isaac Newton's principle way back centuries ago. So that in a rocket, you've got all this hot gas coming out of one end from pressure inside the motor. Well, there's an equal push the other side, and it works great in a vacuum. It doesn't need air whatsoever. So Goddard, that's what drives Goddard to New Mexico. The isolation, the safety of shooting out in the desert, the rockets out in the desert, away from the population centers in Massachusetts. Now, because of that ridicule, Goddard pretty much worked in secrecy. I'm going to contrast that with Hermann Oberth, the German scientist who wrote By Rocket to Interplanetary Space in 1923. Same ideas basically as the Russian and the American, except in Germany, Willy Ley, a journalist, picks up this idea and he's gung-ho. He's going, this is great. And it becomes a thing of culture throughout Germany in the 20s and 30s. And you'll see lots of old videos of Germans putting rockets on everything. Cars, ice skaters, bicycles, airplanes, you name it, they're trying to go faster with rockets on these products. And so it's a big deal. There are clubs all throughout Germany, people that get together, amateurs, build rockets, launch them, see how high they can go. Well, one of those club members was Wernher von Braun. So when Hitler, of course, takes power in Germany in the 1930s and the military is rebuilding, one way of overcoming some of the munitions restrictions in the Versailles Treaty is to build rockets because they're not mentioned in the Versailles Treaty. And so the German military hijacks Wernher von Braun from one of these clubs, and he leads the development of the rocket program, the V2 program, which eventually comes to White Sands Missile Range at the end of the war. The bottom picture is von Braun out at White Sands. Pictures taken, I believe, by Life magazine. So this is a preparation of 3 different V2s by the Germans, and they're getting ready to launch those against England, probably. Here's another one of these pictures taken at White Sands Missile Range. Looking down through the center of this rocket body, you can see von Braun in the center. He's got the white shirt and the tie on. I guess I should try my pointer. I made this big pointer on the windows. Look, works pretty good. Okay, I don't need a pointer. That's von Braun. To the left here is a guy named Pappy White. He's the manager of General Electric out at White Sands. The General Electric Corporation had the contract to assemble and launch V2 rockets at White Sands. Most people assume it was a military operation. It was not. It was contracted out. On the left side of von Braun, back here is Colonel Turner, Lieutenant Colonel Turner, the first commander of White Sands Missile Range. The person to his left, we'll come back, is unknown. And then there's a guy here in officer's uniform, and I believe that's Major James Hamill. He's the guy that escorted von Braun out of Europe and across the United States to the Southwest. And of course, there's a picture of von Braun in the 1960s. Here's a picture of the General Electric team on a V2. This was the display V2 that the missile range had. It was taken downtown for fairs and parades all around the state and elsewhere in the country. There were ports in it that they could open, so you could look in and see parts of the propulsion system, part of the control system, et cetera. At the back of that rocket is Pappy White, and he's got a blowtorch in his hand. He's getting ready to ignite it. Obviously a joke photo. So let's talk about exploring space using rockets. Up until the Second World War, the only way to really get high enough to explore the upper atmosphere was with balloons. And there were a lot of efforts during the 20s and 30s to use balloons to get into the upper atmosphere, but they didn't do real well. The balloons were heavy, and they would get blown around and come apart. And so we had balloons going up 12, 14 miles into the upper atmosphere with instrumentations on. They also put human beings on gondolas or in capsules underneath some of these balloons. The picture at the top right, see if I can make my thing here, is a launch in South Dakota, and that's a manned balloon, and it will go up to an altitude of 14 miles. Now, when I was doing this research, I found out that the builders of some of these balloons in France, or Switzerland and France, and then the United States, were the Picard brothers. Now, you remember Jean-Luc Picard from Star Trek? Well, I read that, in fact, the TV show, Bradbury, took Picard's name because of this balloon research that these guys did. Auguste, I think, is the one that, no, Gene came to the United States, and that's why Bradbury used him. So these were early experiments to find out about the upper atmosphere, what's up there. And one of the GE guys, one of the scientists associated with them, said that in an interview that we know as much about the upper atmosphere as a fish does about what's on land. We were going into this really blind. So rockets come along at the end of the war, and we're going to talk about V2s, but V2s were not the first thing fired at White Sands Missile Range. This Whack Corporal there on the bottom, it was designed by the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California, and the Army gave them money to build this rocket and take up a payload of weather instruments to an altitude of 20 miles. And it worked very well. Let's see, I've got a follow-on picture here. Frank Molina was the chief engineer on this. And this is him posing beside the fifth Whack Corporal. Some dummy ones were fired before the fully fueled one was fired on October 11th, 1945. So that's the first fueled Whack Corporal at White Sands and the first roadblock on Highway 70 out there, because this vehicle had the capability of flying over to the highway and impacting on the highway. So this rocket went up 40 miles. Very much exceeded the expectations. But you don't hear much about it because the V2 came along and really put that out of the way. Here's a typical V2 launch at Launch Complex 33. You've got the V2 taken off. The blockhouse is over here on the left. The V2 tower here. In the background, just sticking out of the smoke, is the top of the Whack Corporal Tower. So all these launches took place at Launch Complex 33. It's now a National Historic Landmark, just like Trinity Site at the northern end of White Sands Missile Range. So the first successful launch of a V2 was in May of 1946. And right away, a guy named Mark Ridge from Massachusetts volunteered to ride one. Would you have done that? The Army said, sorry, we can get you up there probably. You could probably survive the ride up, but we have no way to get you back safely. The idea of automatic deploying parachutes, that technology, we weren't there yet. And anything on there would have died. In fact, we'll talk a little bit about monkeys on board V2s. So in 1946, late 46, the Navy put a camera on a V2, and this is looking out to the west. And the big thing here is that you can see the curvature of the Earth in this photo. It was proof that the Earth is not flat. So here's another bird's eye view taken by the Navy. This one's a little later, 1948, I believe. And it's a composite of several negatives, looks out to the west. And I know you can't read these, so I'll kind of point out this green one here is, let's see, it's just labeled as Mexico. Come on, pointer. The blue one here is the Gulf of California. The orange one or yellow one here is Lordsburg, New Mexico. And the red one way over here is Albuquerque. So you can see this is a great view of the Earth from up above. And I put a meteorologist's dream there. Think of what we do now when we see the satellite images of weather systems and all that, and the radar and whatnot. This is the first time meteorologists are able to look down on the Earth and see these formations of clouds and fronts moving across the landscape. And they had to have looked at this and gone, oh my God, what a valuable tool this would be eventually. So V2s were used to send up instrumentations and stuff and do experiments as well. And I want to also mention a set of experiments or some studies that were going on here in the Las Cruces area during the late 1940s, headed by this guy in the middle up here, Dr. Whipple. It looks like it's cut off the top of his picture, but he was from Harvard University. And he was studying the upper atmosphere by studying asteroids or meteorites as they went through the upper atmosphere. And he got in cahoots with Clyde Tombaugh when Tombaugh was out at White Sands Missile Range and asked Tombaugh what would be good locations to put some of his cameras. Behind Whipple is one of these super duper cameras that he developed. And the idea is that they will have two sites and they will film the same section of sky and they will film meteorites going through it. And because it's two places, you can do the geometry and measure how high it is, and you can measure its movement from frame to frame then across the sky, and maybe to do something about upper atmospheric winds, stuff like that. So Whipple came to New Mexico to do this for two reasons. One is that there'd been a report in the 1930s that Las Cruces had some of the darkest skies in North America. It was right at the top of places to go in North America where you'd get 5.5, 6 hours of darkness at night and almost all year round that you could do observing of meteorites. And also, Whipple realized that big rockets like V2s and other things going up high into the atmosphere, eventually 100 miles and falling back to Earth, are essentially meteorites, man-made, and that they could piggyback on that and study those as well. So I got a picture of Clyde Tombaugh down here working at White Sands, developing telescopes for tracking missiles and rockets during firing. So on the left is Turner, the first commander, getting ready for a V2 firing where they're going to create man-made meteorites. And he's holding a rifle grenade. And to his left, that's James Van Allen holding another rifle grenade. And on the tips of these rifle grenades, they put little dime-sized pieces of metal. And the idea is that the V2 is going to give these things a boost into the upper atmosphere. The grenades are going to fire, they're going to explode and send those little dime-sized projectiles at supersonic speeds out and make them meteorites. And that Whipple and other people are going to be able to take pictures of that. Well, it didn't work. But it was an interesting experiment. And it shows you that James Van Allen was part of this process early on. You've heard of the Van Allen belts around the planet. He's the guy that discovered it on other flights, rocket flights. And of course, he was involved in the development of our first satellites. So this is the setup that Whipple had. This is the site that's out in the Doñana Mountains. I discovered this decades ago riding my bike out here. Some of these concrete pads and stuff are still out there. This is the site that's at Talavera, which is the second site. They're about 18 miles apart. And these concrete pads and whatnot are still out there. And you can see how the camera mounts on the 45-degree slab of concrete. And I'm not going to talk about GEODS. GEODS is my favorite acronym at White Sands Missile Range, Ground-Based Electro-Optical Deep Space Surveillance. And this is Air Force looking into the space with telescopes and tracking the movement of satellites, much like they track meteorites through the sky. So V2s at White Sands were left open for universities, experimental groups, people that wanted to put packages on board of V2s, cameras, instrumentation, all kinds of stuff. And there was a board reviewing those. Van Allen headed that board. And these are some of the accomplishments. They did gas sampling at various levels to measure what gases are actually up there, their concentrations, the temperature measurements. They discovered that, lo and behold, instead of getting colder and colder, the atmosphere gets warmer at one point before it goes cold again. Atmospheric pressure. They were very concerned about cosmic radiation. After the atomic bomb test at Trinity and its use in Japan, everybody becomes very aware of radiation. And they're aware that the sun is sending a lot of it our way. and they were concerned about this. And in fact, some of the plant studies were sending seeds up into the upper atmosphere, exposing them to cosmic radiation, retrieving those seeds and planting them to see what happens. Spectrograph images of the sun. There were experiments to recover payloads. Also, the first multi-stage vehicle was fired at White Sands using a V2 and a WAC Corporal on top of it. The WAC Corporal reached an altitude of 250 miles, space by anybody's definition. And then I've got highlighted in red the mammal exposure. They tried to send up monkeys in a couple of these V2s. Unfortunately, the parachute devices, things like that didn't work. However, on one of them, they were telemetering or radioing information from the monkey, measuring respiration and heart rate. And during that flight, the high G's of liftoff and the apogee, when basically the monkey would have been free floating if he'd been not tied down, respiration and heart rate were within normal parameters. It must have given scientists and medical people confidence that a large mammal like me or you would be able to fly on a spacecraft eventually. I can't overemphasize how important all this was back in the 40s and 50s. Like we talk about digital stuff, we've been talking about digital for a long time now and how everything has to be digital because that's better. And now we're doing AI, everything's better with AI, et cetera, et cetera. Well, back in the 40s into the 50s, rocket technology was the big thing. And here you've got an Oldsmobile ad for their Rocket 88. Some of you remember that, the rocket engine, et cetera, et cetera. Here's another one, the Rocket 88. I have a whole collection of ads during that period, paper ads from magazines and stuff, various companies using rocket jargon to sell their product. Not all the V2s went well. This one, launched on May 29, 1947, was built actually down in Fort Bliss because it was a German development. And this one, instead of going north, went south. This is the one that crashed outside of Juarez. The missile range was probably that close to going out of business because if it had come up short and landed in Juarez or downtown El Paso and killed 60 kids in a school, I suspect the missile range might have been put out of business. But it landed outside of Juarez, near a cemetery, made a big hole in the ground, no injuries, no damage. We apologized and the Mexican government accepted. 2 weeks before that, they put one over outside of Alamogordo, out where the Space Museum is now. There was nothing up there in those days. So this idea of sending rockets into the upper atmosphere, it's called sounding rockets, and it's the longest running program at White Sands. It continues today. The Navy takes rockets or programs and stuff from other people, mostly NASA, and they bring them into this Army installation at White Sands, and there are contractors that work on it as well. And they put up these sounding rockets to do upper atmospheric work. Most of them now are astronomy related. They're sending up things to look at the sun. They go at night to look at some star system, something like that. My example here is a Black Brant rocket being launched with a Terrier booster to study comet Hale-Bopp back in the 90s. This was a plan to put, and in most of these flights in the 90s, it's a 2-week period for Hale-Bopp, the payloads were going up about 170 to 200 miles above the Earth. Puts them above the atmosphere where they can collect ultraviolet light from the Hale-Bopp and try to make some determinations about its origin, et cetera. And so for 2 weeks, we sent up 4 of these rockets. The public was invited to come out and watch. It was a lot of fun. So they also do experiments on board. I was out for one of these rocket shots, a Black Brant, and I was talking to the experimenters and asked them what they were doing. And he said, we're going to burn some plexiglass at apogee of the flight. Huh? He said, well, we're very concerned about fire on board the Space Shuttle and on board the space station. We've got an oxygen-rich environment. What happens if a fire breaks out? And you all know from grade school that you learn there's 3 things necessary for a fire, right? Fuel, heat, and oxygen. Those are the three things that make a fire go. Well, the experimenter was telling me that on the first one of these flights, they lit the plexiglass. And they use plexiglass because they got a lot of science behind it. They understand it to extreme measure because it's man-made. And so they lit this stuff up there 150 miles, and the plexiglass, the fire went out. And they rubbed their heads and went, what's that all about? So they started thinking about it. And of course, gravity gives us what's up and down. You know, you see the astronauts in the space station free floating around, upside down, right side up. Well, there is no up or down. To them, it's all the same. And so that's what happens on these flames, is that if you light a candle, and I've got a candle lit there as an example, that's that teardrop shape. You have the ignition of the candle, the heat rises up and pushes all the exhaust gases, the smoke up. It allows the oxygen to come in from below and keep feeding the combustion process, right? In space, since there is no up and down, it's more like this. Those gases and smoke come off in a ball and will completely surround the combustion and basically snuff off the source of oxygen, the flow of oxygen to it. I just thought that was kind of cool. So I've added a fourth item to what you need for a fire. Gravity doesn't work without it. They also use sounding rockets to calibrate satellites. You know, satellites up in space getting blasted by radiation and all kinds of things year after year. How do you know that the instruments, like measuring the ozone down here in the upper levels of the atmosphere, how do you know that it's still measuring correctly? Well, one way to do it is to send an instrument, an actual instrument that's been calibrated on one of these rockets through the ozone layer at the same time one of these satellites is taking measurements. And you can compare, because you know the rocket's going to be accurate. That instrument's going to be right on. And you can recalibrate the one in the satellite. So at White Sands, some other things that we did back in the 60s, this planetary entry parachute program, it's PEPSHEL, and you see the flying saucer-like vehicle that's in the missile park at White Sands. This is getting prepared for testing parachute systems for Viking landings, putting instruments on the Mars for Viking later on. And it's an interesting idea because it's not simply a parachute lowering these items through the atmosphere, because Mars's atmosphere is really, really thin. It would take a huge parachute to land something there. These parachutes were meant to slow it down because this package coming from Earth is going to be going thousands of miles an hour, and it's going to be wanting to shoot right by Mars, go into that low atmosphere, and you got to slow it down. So you got to deploy a parachute on basically a horizontal flight to slow down the capsule and then bring it in. So this was a preparation for the 2 Mars landings in '76, another program that was done in '71. And you can see a diagram of the flight. These were launched in Roswell, outside of Roswell. The balloons would drift over the missile range where they would then release the device and the rocket engines would fire and they would do a landing. And there's a diagram of those flights. And this is the same idea used by Rendezvous just a few years ago. In the top left, you've got the vehicle coming into the atmosphere. It's got a heat shield on it to kind of slow it down in that thin atmosphere. And then a parachute deploys to really slow it down. And then it's got some retro rockets to slowly lower it down to the surface of Mars. So let's get into manned programs. So, you know, Mercury were the first flights for the United States. Basically, those first shots were up and down off the coast of Florida. But eventually, as part of the Mercury process, we were doing orbital flights. So John Glenn was the first guy to orbit the Earth for the United States. Well, if you remember those flights, there were times when we couldn't hear from them. There was no radio communication with them. We didn't know where the capsule was. There were blackout periods. And so NASA engaged lots of people with radars and stuff to track the capsules that went around the Earth. And at White Sands Missile Range, they they use the radars that the missile range uses to track missiles and rockets. And this is an FPS-16, like the one that was used to track Glenn, Carpenter, Shira, and Cooper as they orbited the Earth during the Mercury and then the Gemini program as well. At that time, as we're getting ready for Apollo, and here's a little bit of real trivia for you, NASA asked a number of places, installations, to propose launch sites and landing sites for the Apollo program. And so they asked White Sands Missile Range, can you launch Saturn V rockets from White Sands? And the missile range had about a month to put together a study for a multi-billion-dollar program. And so it was quick and dirty. Whoops, and I'm going crazy here. Oh my gosh. It was a quick study, and they proposed a site north of Oregon out here for the launches. It was on the very west edge of White Sands Missile Range, about where the White Sands test facility is located now. Can you imagine in Las Cruces sitting on your patio some morning and watching a Saturn V rocket lift off out there? That would have been so cool. I mean, unbelievable. Everything would have been shaking as it took off. And at the same time, well, the infrastructure was going to be incredible that they were going to have to build out there. It's going to be huge. At the same time, they asked Holloman to propose a landing site. So Holloman got together with the missile range, and they proposed the lake bed out in the middle of the range that is called Alkali Flat and stuff. So I threw this picture in of a Saturn being transported from its assembly area. And in the parking lots down here, you can see the cars. So you know how big that rocket is. And so I don't think that the proposal was done in a very serious manner. I mean, I think they were punching a ticket that was necessary to gather information, say, hey, we solicited input from other people, and it's not going to work. And there are a couple of reasons why it's not going to work at White Sands out here. One is that these Saturn boosters are like 35 feet in diameter. How big are the bridges going over the interstates? What do you see, 17, 18, 19 feet? You're not getting any of those boosters under. You're going to have to go around. Power lines are usually 20, 30 feet. You're not getting a booster under any power lines, any cable lines, anywhere. It would have been almost impossible to transport them to New Mexico. They would have had to probably build them out at the site. The other reason is that for these flights, because of the orbits they wanted to do, the orbit is to the east. And if you'll remember, when we took off from Cape Canaveral, the rockets would take off to the east and they would drop their boosters, various boosters, out in the empty Atlantic Ocean. If you launched from here, where were those boosters going to drop? Texas, Louisiana, places like that. NASA probably would not have been happy if they were dropping boosters on New Orleans or something like that. Here's a picture of one of the boosters on a barge being used to transport them around to the Cape. So the Apollo landing site was in the middle of this white lake bed here, space vehicle site, which eventually gets used by Space Shuttle, and Boeing is using this now for Starliner. So it's a site that you can see from space. Now, one of the things we heard from astronauts during the shuttle program is that they gave them a nice warm feeling that they could actually see the landing site from space as they're orbiting the Earth. And eventually you get these 35,000-foot runways out there on the lake bed. That's 7 miles of runway. That's a lot of forgiveness also if you make a mistake. So we didn't get Apollo launches or landings at White Sands, but we did get something out of the Apollo program. The NASA test facility, Johnson Space Center test facility out here north of Oregon. And they test smaller rocket engines, like on the Space Shuttle. You can see a picture here at the back end of the Space Shuttle. You got the main engines in the center. Those are too big to test out here. But the OMS, the orbital maneuvering system engines on the back end, which raise the shuttle in orbit or decrease it and slow it down for a deorbit, for the deorbit burns. Those are tested out at the White Sands test facility. So again, another small tie-in with White Sands Missile Range and the activities out there with space activities. So there were some other Apollo things that went on at White Sands. Apollo came up with an abort and a capsule abort system. This thing on top of the capsule here, you can see, is an escape system. And the idea is that if something goes wrong during launch, that the rocket on the top here could pull the capsule and the astronauts away from the malfunctioning rocket and parachute them safely. So there were a series of these tests done at White Sands using this jury-rigged rocket called Little Joe. And over here on the right, this is the first picture of the first firing at White Sands. And there's a guy named Bob Gilbreth up there at the top. And congratulations. And this is signed by Charles Conrad, Gordon Cooper, Jim Lovell, Alan Shepard, and Deke Slayton. All those early astronauts were out here to watch that test firing of this escape system. And you're wondering, who was Bill or Bob Gilbreth? He was their boss. He was in charge of astronauts for NASA at that time. So here's a diagram of what that looks like. The booster or the rocket engine on top pulling the capsule away, and then parachutes being deployed. So Apollo used that. When the space shuttle ended and NASA went to Orion, was going to be the next space vehicle for them, back to a capsule on top of a rocket. They did a pad abort test at White Sands. And now the Starliner for Boeing has done identical tests at White Sands. Same idea. So, you know, when you look at those first films of men on the moon and you see them moving around and they're kind of hippie hopping, I always thought, well, maybe they're playing with the lack of gravity, getting the feel of it and stuff. Well, you know what that is? The stupid spacesuits don't have joints in the knees and stuff. They can't bend their legs. And it was cheap, easy, safe way to put a spacesuit together. So on subsequent flights, for instance, Apollo 15, when they take the dune buggy up and they're going to drive around, they need to be able to bend down and get soil samples, rocks. They need to be able to get up into the dune buggy. They need to be able to sit in it. They need to bend their legs, bend at the waist, etc. So NASA had to come up with a new spacesuit, something that had these joints in it. Also, during those first flights, they discovered that the moon is really a dusty place. You know, those first spacesuits that came back are on display. You can see them. They're gray. They're not white anymore. They're gray from the dust. And so NASA realized that they had a little bit of a problem here. So what do we do with the joints that we're going to build into this, the hinges and stuff, because they're going to be metal? What if dust gets in there and the grit freezes those joints? What if an astronaut's 3 miles away from the space vehicle and he can't get back into the dune buggy to go back to the space capsule? So they brought a spacesuit to White Sands Missile Range because the missile range has a dust chamber. They used to. They don't. This has been it's an abandoned facility now. But in the early days, the missile range has always been big on testing technologies in the climates that they're going to encounter in the real world. Heat, cold, snow, rain, you name it, dust. So they built a dust chamber in the 50s that can simulate dusty situations using different kinds of dust, etc. So for the Apollo 15 moon suit, the contractor and NASA brought a guy, David Burris, over with the suit, and they put him inside this dust chamber, and there's a fan in there to blow the dust at high velocities. They varied the temperature all the way up to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, and they put him in there for 4 different sessions, 30 minutes at a whack, to do things and to see if the suit, how it would respond. And it worked. These are the guys monitoring Burris inside the chamber, and they're looking in that window that you can see. I took this picture years ago of the abandoned dust chamber. So after Apollo, we get the Space Shuttle, and NASA wants to use the desert or the landing site out in the alkali flats that had been proposed by the Air Force because there was already a landing strip there for drones. And NASA is allowed to do that. And that turns into pilot training. That then turns into improved runways and a backup landing sites for the space shuttle, which gets called into use on March 30th, 1982, just the third flight of the space shuttle. And the reason it gets used is that the landing, well, the protocols at the beginning are to land on a softer surface, no concrete landings yet. So they can't land at Edwards for this March flight. And so NASA wants to prove to the world that they can stay on a schedule, because if you'll remember, NASA promoted the space shuttle as a trucking thing. You know, UPS had just started, FedEx was getting going, and NASA was using that analogy to say, we're going to take stuff to space and we can do it regularly. And so they wanted to stay on their schedule, and they went ahead and launched this flight, even though they knew they couldn't land at Edwards. They chose to land at White Sands. So here it is landing on the 30th that morning at 9:04. I worked that. I was out there. It was a long couple of weeks of preparation because they announced it a couple of weeks beforehand that it would land there. And we took care of the news media. And we had over 800 news media types registered in my office. And not all of them are reporters, lots of support people. The networks hauled in house trailers, put wooden frames on the top of them so they could mount cameras on them. People from foreign countries, radio stations, TV stations, you name it, they came. And they came early. They'd come out a week beforehand. So in my office, we had to entertain them. And NASA didn't want to talk to them. They only wanted to talk to the three networks. So it was an opportunity for the missile range to tell our story. We took people to see the Range Control Center, Trinity site, all kinds of stuff. It was a great couple of weeks. So these are some of the photographers on the line out there at the runway. And the astronauts coming off the shuttle. There's Jack Lousma, Gordon Fullerton. And they picked up the shuttle, drove the 747 underneath it, and flew it away on April 6th. So that was the only landing at White Sands. And we were close in 2002, I think, somewhere in there to getting another one. But the place was more important to NASA than the landings. It was always a backup site and got called up a few times for abort once around missions. But 85% of the pilot training took place at White Sands. The pilots would come from Houston or wherever and go to El Paso and get in this Grumman jet, which has been reconfigured inside to act and look like the space shuttle. The controls on the pilot side were just like in the space shuttle. They've even got templates on the window to give them a narrow point of view out the window. And these guys would fly it up over the missile range, go up to 30, 35,000 feet, and reverse the jet engines. So it just start falling out of the sky, and they would glide into those runways, not do a touchdown, just a few feet above the ground, as if they were landing in the space shuttle, that same elevation above the ground. Reverse the engines, go around, do it again. They did it day and night, crosswinds, tailwinds, headwinds, all kinds of conditions, simulating what they might run into. So it was pretty valuable. And this is what the runway looks like now. The asphalt edging is left. And there are reflectors out there because they did have lights, big spotlights to shine down the runways to illuminate just reflected spots on the runway so the pilot could see them. Also in the 90s, we had the Delta Clipper, McDonnell Douglas. It was a kind of an exciting time. People were looking at space and looking at new technologies maybe. And this was the holy grail, was to build a single stage to orbit vehicle. Don't drop a booster. So McDonnell Douglas was building this, and they did some flights, and you can see it sits upright like this. That's the way it landed as well, on its tail. And it would go up and do maneuvers, turn sideways, do a bunch of things. On its 12th flight, did a perfect flight, but when it landed, one of the struts failed to deploy, and over it went and boom, exploded and burned. Kind of what the X people are doing when their boosters come back down and they retrieve them. Also at the NASA facility out there, And in those times when the space shuttle or capsules are going around the Earth with men in them, there were blackout times and you couldn't communicate with them. Well, NASA solved that by putting some communication satellites at 20,000 miles out that are in geosynchronous orbit. This facility at the NASA site can see both of those satellites. And so they can transmit communications back and forth, and any vehicle orbiting the Earth can usually see one of those satellites. So there's never a dark period anymore for vehicles orbiting the Earth. And you can see the antennas down there in the foreground. So here's a Boeing abort test at White Sands, much like Apollo was, a little smaller vehicle. And you've got a Starliner launch at the Cape. And here it comes down at White Sands using the parachute. And you see the capsule there on White Sands after it's landed. And I'm not going to comment about Boeing's problems with Starliner. They do have some serious problems. And it'll be interesting to see what they decide to do, whether they can the whole program or continue marching on. And there it is on the first flight when it was out there at night. I'm running out of time. I was going to talk about Roswell and how work at White Sands and Holloman directly led to this legend or myth. Oh, actually, that clock is wrong. I'll give you a quick overrun. So the alien invasion began in the 1940s, right? With Roswell. Everybody knows the story about the capsule, the debris found on Brazel's ranch, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a headline from the Roswell Daily Record, and the story recounts how Brazel came into town, found the sheriff, said he got this stuff, and he had it on the back seat of his car. It's some foil and sticks and plastic pieces. And they turned it over to Roswell. And it turns out that it's the Project Mogul balloon. So here we've got another space-related experiment going on at White Sands done by the Air Force. And during World War II, we learned that low-frequency explosions, the low-frequency end of the explosion travels tremendous distances. Submarines were able to hear or detect explosions thousands of miles away underwater. And so the theory went after the war, maybe we could detect a nuclear explosion in the atmosphere in Russia, in the upper atmosphere. Maybe that fluid would transmit that sound if we put some sensitive instruments on balloons and kept them aloft in the upper atmosphere for a week or two on end, keep doing this. So Mogul was that experiment. And it was a secret program. The Air Force didn't want the world to know about it, that we were listening, actively listening for the Russians to have an atomic bomb. And of course, we were telling the public that the Russians, oh, they're not going to get an atomic bomb. We weren't telling them that there were spies up in Los Alamos, et cetera. So you can see the materials there. You can see radar reflectors down here at the bottom right. It's basically aluminum foil stretched on sticks. You've got these mylar balloons and material in between that were launched at Holloman, a whole series of these. And here's some of the debris found out there that Brazel turned into the Air Force, picture of it released by the Air Force afterwards. Of course, the believers will tell you that's all fake, that the Air Force was quick enough. And I tell you, working for the military, I can tell you they're not that quick. Within a day, responded with this fake story and fake stuff and covered it all up. But this is the picture that was taken. Oh, and so anyway, I mean, you're left with believing some real program with real experiments being done and somebody finding this debris and putting it under a bush and putting it in the backseat of the car, or that a whole spacecraft crashed out there with aliens and the whole 9 yards. Another aspect of the Roswell situation this guy gets credit for. So we've got that initial report of a vehicle. John Stapp was over at Holloman, and the Air Force, after the war, beginning of the 50s, gets jet aircraft. And they've suddenly got all these issues, health, biological, mechanical issues for pilots they're suddenly going to be able to fly faster than the speed of sound. They're going to be way up high in the atmosphere where there's very little air. They're going to have to be able to eject at high speeds, have parachutes to safely bring them back to the ground after being ejected at high altitudes. How's that all going to work? Well, John Stapp was the doctor in charge at Holloman for finding answers to most of those questions. He's the guy that rode the sled track at Holloman. Everybody makes a big deal that he went 650 miles an hour on the sled track. That wasn't what the test was about. The test was about restraints, lap belts and straps over the shoulders during the stopping of that, because he stopped going after 650 miles in just 1.5 seconds. That's a lot of G forces that he's exposed to. And he understood that you needed to have the same thing in airplanes if you're going to have crashes and stuff, to save the pilots, the crews and stuff, instead of just sitting in a chair inside an airplane. Interestingly, his work investigating restraint systems led him to look at all the records for the Air Force. And he found that, lo and behold, more pilots, co-pilots, navigators and stuff are injured and killed in car accidents than plane accidents. And so he became an advocate for car seat belts. In fact, he devised a little slope thing that you could sit in and ride it like 10 feet down, just slide down and suddenly come to a stop. And you could have a seatbelt on and you could feel that force as you did that. And he took it around, he showed it to state police, safety groups, et cetera, et cetera. The car manufacturers heard about this and they went to the Air Force and said, you've got a guy, an Air Force guy, colonel, that's butting into our business. He has no business doing this stuff. You should tell him to stop. And so Stapp explained to them the statistics and what the reality was. And they said, okay, keep going. So Stapp was doing all this work to test parachutes. He had balloons go aloft with dummies, anthropomorphic dummies. He's the first guy to use realistic dummies on parachute tests. His devices dropped these dummies off these balloons, then parachutes drifted then. So the Air Force guys were running all over southern New Mexico, picking up these heavy anthropomorphic dummies with their limbs falling like this because everything moved, unlike just a sandbag, which is what they used in the early days. And they would use body bags to corral these dummies and put them, because they weighed 140 or 50 pounds. Put them in there, put them on stretchers, put them in old World War II ambulances, and take them back to Holloman. So in cases, in some of the reports you'll see, none of this was reported as alien stuff back in the 50s when this was going on. That happens in the 70s when some of these authors went back and said, well, weren't there alien stuff going on? And the guy goes, well, I remember the Air Force coming out and picking up a body, and he's kind of gray, and he had webbed hands and stuff like that. And these guys that went out and picked up these Sierra Sam dummies will say, well, yeah, different manufacturers had different colors of plastic, and they webbed their fingers together because the fingers would break off if they kept them as individual digits and stuff like that. So people, after 20 years of memory change, we know how that works, we're suddenly seeing aliens being picked up out in the deserts of Roswell area. So I'm done. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm curious as to whether there's been a program in alternative propulsion mechanisms, fusion, ion rockets, what else at White Sands?
Not at White Sands. That kind of really futuristic stuff would be done in laboratories yet. When they get to the point of actually wanting to test a bigger vehicle, something above just laboratory level, yeah, then they might look at some place like White Sands. And they need a place that, you can be out in the middle of nowhere where things go bad, nobody's going to get hurt, that kind of thing. But not recently, no. Now, there have been a lot of laser testing out there. There is the HELSTAF, High Energy Laser Systems Test Facility, and that was built to test high energy lasers as weapons for the military. And there's a Navy laser out there called Miracle, which is a big chemical laser. And it burns chemicals just like a rocket engine. And the light produced on that can then be focused downstream on targets and whatnot. The beam is about that big around. It's quite an energetic laser. Anything else? If not, thank you very much.